Alexandre Dumas, The Man in the Iron Mask. Chapter 16, Jealousy. The torches we have just referred to, the eager attention of everyone displayed, and the new ovation paid to the king by Fouquet arrived in time to suspend the effect of a revolution which La Valliere had already considerably shaken in Louis XIV's heart. He looked at Fouquet with a feeling almost of gratitude for having given La Valliere an opportunity of showing herself so generously disposed, so powerful in the influence she exercised over his heart. The moment of the last and greatest display had arrived. Hardly had Fouquet conducted the king towards the chateau when a mass of fire bursts from the dome of Vaux with a prodigious uproar, pouring a flood of dazzling cataracts of rays on every side and illuminating the remotest corners of the gardens. The fireworks began. Colbert, at 20 paces from the king, who was surrounded and feted by the owner of Vaux, seemed, by the obstinate persistence of his gloomy thoughts, to do his utmost to recall Louis's attention, which the magnificence of the spectacle was already, in his opinion, too easily diverting. Suddenly, just as Louis was about on the point of holding it out to Fouquet, he perceived in his hand the paper which, as he believed, La Valliere had dropped at his feet as she hurried away. Still, the stronger magnet of love drew the prince's attention towards the souvenir of his idol, and by the brilliant light, which increased momentarily in beauty and drew from the neighboring villages loud cheers of admiration, the king read the letter, which he supposed was a loving and tender epistle La Valliere had destined for him. But as he read it, a death-like pallor stole over his face, and an expression of deep-seated wrath, illuminated by the many-colored fire which gleamed so brightly, soaringly around the scene, produced a terrible spectacle, which everyone would have shuddered at, could they only have read into his heart, now torn by the most stormy and most bitter passions. There was no truce for him now, influenced as he was by jealousy and mad passion. From the very moment when the dark truth was revealed to him, every gentler feeling seemed to disappear. Pity, kindness of consideration, the religion of hospitality, all were forgotten. In the bitter pang which wrung his heart, he, still too weak to hide his sufferings, was almost on the point of uttering a cry of alarm and calling his guards to gather round him. This letter, which Colbert had thrown down at the king's feet, the reader has doubtlessly guessed, was the same that had disappeared with the porter Toby at Fontainebleau, after the attempt which Fouquet had made upon La Valliere's heart. Fouquet saw the king's pallor and was far from guessing the evil. Colbert saw the king's anger and rejoiced inwardly at the approach of the storm. Fouquet's voice drew the young prince from his wrathful reverie. "What is the matter, sire?" inquired the superintendent with an expression of graceful interest. Louis made a violent effort over himself as he replied, "Nothing." "I am afraid your majesty is suffering?" "I am suffering, and have already told you so, monsieur, but it is nothing." And the king, without waiting for the termination of the fireworks, turned towards the chateau. Fouquet accompanied him, and the whole court followed, leaving the remains of the fireworks consuming for their own amusement. The superintendent endeavored again to question Louis XIV, but did not succeed in obtaining a reply. He imagined that there had been some misunderstanding between Louis and La Valliere in the park, which had resulted in a slight quarrel, and that the king, who was not ordinarily sulky by disposition, but completely absorbed by his passion for La Valliere, had taken a dislike to everyone because his mistress had shown herself offended with him. This idea was sufficient to console him. He had even a friendly and kindly smile for the young king when the latter wished him good night. This, however, was not all the king had to submit to. He was obliged to undergo the usual ceremony, which on that evening was marked by close adherence to the strictest etiquette. The next day was the one fixed for the departure, but it was proper that the guests should thank their host and show him a little attention in return for the expenditure of his 12 millions. The only remark approaching to amiability which the king could find to say to Monsieur Fouquet as he took leave of him were in these words: "Monsieur Fouquet, you shall hear from me. Be good enough to desire Monsieur d'Artagnan to come here." But the blood of Louis XIV, who had so profoundly dissimulated his feelings, boiled in his veins, and he was perfectly willing to order Monsieur Fouquet to be put an end to with the same readiness, indeed, as his predecessor had caused the assassination of Le Marechal d'Ancre, and so he disguised the terrible resolution he had formed beneath one of those royal smiles which, like lightning flashes, indicated coup d'état. Fouquet took the king's hand and kissed it. Louis shuddered throughout his whole frame, but allowed Monsieur Fouquet to touch his hand with his lips. 5 minutes afterwards, D'Artagnan, to whom the royal order had been communicated, entered Louis XIV's apartment. Aramis and Philippe were in theirs, still eagerly attentive, and still listening with all their ears. The king did not even give the captain of the Musketeers time to approach his armchair, but ran forward to meet him. "Take care," he exclaimed, "that no one enters here." "Very good, sire," replied the captain, whose glance had for a long time past analyzed the stormy indications on the royal countenance. He gave the necessary order at the door, but returning to the king, he said, "Is there something fresh the matter with your majesty?" "How many men have you here?" inquired the king, without making any other reply to the question addressed to him. "What for, sire?" "How many men have you, I say?" repeated the king, stamping upon the ground with his foot. "I have the Musketeers." "Well, and what others?" 20 guards and 13 Swiss. "How many men will be required to—" "To do what, sire?" replied the musketeer, opening his large, calm eyes. "To arrest Monsieur Fouquet." D'Artagnan fell back a step. "To arrest Monsieur Fouquet?" he burst forth. "Are you going to tell me that it is impossible?" exclaimed the king in tones of cold, vindictive passion. "I never say that anything is impossible," replied D'Artagnan, wounded to the quick. "Very well, do it then." D'Artagnan turned on his heel and made his way towards the door. It was but a short distance, and he cleared it in half a dozen paces. When he reached it, he suddenly paused and said, "Your Majesty will forgive me, but in order to effect this arrest, I should like written directions." "For what purpose, and since when has the king's word been insufficient for you?" "Because the word of a king, when it springs from a feeling of anger, may possibly change when the feeling changes." "A truce to set phrases, monsieur. You have another thought besides that?" "Oh, I, at least, have certain thoughts and ideas which, unfortunately, others have not," D'Artagnan replied impertinently. The king, in the tempest of his wrath, hesitated and drew back in the face of D'Artagnan's frank courage, just as a horse crouches on his haunches under a strong hand of a bold and experienced rider. "What is your thought?" he exclaimed. "This, sire," replied D'Artagnan. "You cause a man to be arrested when you are still under his roof, and passion is alone the cause of that. When your anger shall have passed, you will regret what you have done, and then I wish to be in a position to show you your signature. If that, however, should fail to be a reparation, it will, at least, show us that the king was wrong to lose his temper." "Wrong to lose his temper!" cried the king in a loud, passionate voice. "Did not my father, my grandfathers too before me, lose their temper at times, in heaven's name?" "The king, your father, and the king, your grandfather, never lost their temper, except when under the protection of their own palace." "The king is master wherever he may be." That is a flattering, complimentary phrase which cannot proceed from anyone but Monsieur Colbert. But it happens not to be the truth. The king is at home in every man's house, when he has driven its owner out of it. The king bit his lips, but said nothing. "Can it be possible," said D'Artagnan, "here is a man who is positively ruining himself in order to please you, and you wish to have him arrested? Mordieu! Sire, if my name was Fouquet, and people treated me in that manner, I would swallow at a single gulp all sorts of fireworks and other things, and I would set fire to them, and send myself and everybody else in blown-up atoms to the sky. But it is all the same, it is your wish, and it shall be done." "Go," said the king, "but have you enough men?" "Do you suppose I am going to take a whole host to help me arrest Monsieur Fouquet? Why, that is so easy that a very child might do it. It is like drinking a glass of wormwood. One makes an ugly face, and that is all. If he defends himself, it is not at all likely, defend himself when such extreme harshness as you are going to practice makes the man a very martyr. Nay, I am sure that if he has 1,000,000 of francs left, which I very much doubt, he would be willing enough to give it in order to have such a termination as this. But what does that matter? It shall be done at once." "Stay," said the king. "Do not make his arrest a public affair." "That will be more difficult." "Why so?" "Because nothing is easier than to go up to Monsieur Fouquet in the midst of 1,000 enthusiastic guests who surround him, and say, 'In the king's name, I arrest you.' But to go up to him, to turn him first one way and then another, to drive him up into one of the corners of the chessboard in such a way that he cannot escape, to take him away from his guests, and keep him a prisoner for you, without one of them, alas, having heard anything about it, that indeed is a genuine difficulty, the greatest of all, in truth, and I hardly see how it is to be done." "You had better say it is impossible, and you will have finished much sooner. Heaven help me, but I seem to be surrounded by people who prevent me doing what I wish." "I do not prevent you doing anything." "Have you indeed decided?" "Take care of Monsieur Fouquet until I have made up my mind by tomorrow morning." "That shall be done, sire." "And return, when I rise in the morning, for further orders, and now leave me to myself." "You do not even want Monsieur Colbert, then?" said the Musketeer, firing his last shot as he was leaving the room. The king started. With his whole mind fixed on the thought of revenge, he had forgotten the cause and substance of the offense. "No, no one," he said. "No one here. Leave me." D'Artagnan quitted the room. The king closed the door with his own hands and began to walk up and down his apartment at a furious pace, like a wounded bull in an arena, trailing from his horn the colored streamers and the iron darts. At last he began to take comfort in the expression of his violent feelings. Miserable wretch that he is! Not only does he squander my finances, but with his ill-gotten plunder he corrupts secretaries, friends, generals, artists, and all, and tries to rob me of the one to whom I am most attached. This is the reason that perfidious girl so boldly took his part. Gratitude, and who can tell whether it was not a strong feeling? Love itself? He gave himself up for a moment to the bitterest reflections. A satyr, he thought, with that abhorrent hate with which young men regard those more advanced in life who still think of love. A man who has never found opposition or resistance in anyone, who lavishes his gold and jewels in every direction, and who retains his staff of painters in order to take the portraits of his mistresses in the costume of goddesses. The king trembled with passion as he continued. He pollutes and profanes everything that belongs to me. He destroys everything that is mine. He will be my death at last, I know. That man is too much for me, and he is my mortal enemy. But he shall forthwith fall. I hate him. I hate him. I hate him. And as he pronounced these words, he struck the arm of the chair in which he was sitting violently, over and over again, and then rose like one in an epileptic fit. Tomorrow, oh happy day, he murmured. When the sun rises, no other rival shall that brilliant king of space possess but me. That man shall fall so low that when people look at the abject ruin my anger shall have wrought, they will be forced to confess at last, and at least that I am indeed greater than him." The king, who was incapable of mastering his emotions any longer, knocked over with a blow of his fist a small table placed close to his bedside, and in the very bitterness of anger, almost weeping and half suffocated, he threw himself on his bed, dressed as he was, and bit the sheets in his extremity of passion, trying to find repose of body at least there. The bed creaked beneath his weight, and with the exception of a few broken sounds emerging, or one might say exploding, from his overburdened chest, absolute silence soon reigned in the chamber of Morpheus. Chapter 17. High Treason. The ungovernable fury which took possession of the king at the sight and the perusal of Fouquet's letter to La Valliere by degrees subsided into a feeling of pain and extreme weariness. Youth, invigorated by health and lightness of spirits, requiring soon that what it loses should be immediately restored, youth knows not those endless, sleepless nights which enable us to realize the fable of the vulture unceasingly feeding on Prometheus. In cases where the man of middle life, in his acquired strength of will and purpose, and the old, in their state of natural exhaustion, find incessant augmentation of their bitter sorrow, a young man, surprised by the sudden appearance of misfortune, weakens himself in sighs and groans and tears, directly struggling with his grief, and is thereby far sooner overthrown by the inflexible enemy with whom he is engaged. Once overthrown, his struggles cease. Louis could not hold out more than a few minutes, at the end of which he had ceased to clench his hands and scorch in fancy with his looks the invisible objects of his hatred. He soon ceased to attack with his violent imprecations, not Monsieur Fouquet alone, but even La Valliere herself. From fury he subsided into despair, and from despair to prostration. After he had thrown himself for a few minutes to and fro convulsively on his bed, his nerveless arms fell quietly down, and his head lay languidly on his pillow. His limbs, exhausted with excessive emotion, still trembled occasionally, agitated by muscular contractions, while from his breast faint and infrequent sighs still issued. Morpheus, the tutelary deity of the apartment, towards whom Louis raised his eyes, wearied by his anger and reconciled by his tears, showered down upon him the sleep-inducing poppies with which his hands are ever filled. So presently the monarch closed his eyes and fell asleep. Then it seemed to him, as it oft happens in that first sleep, so light and gentle, which raises the body above the couch, and the soul above the earth, it seemed to him, we say, as if the god Morpheus, painted on the ceiling, looked at him with eyes resembling human eyes, that something shone brightly and moved to and fro in the dome above the sleeper, that the crowd of terrible dreams which thronged together in his brain, and which were interrupted for a moment, half revealed a human face, with a hand resting against the mouth, and in an attitude of deep and absorbed meditation. And strange enough, too, this man bore so wonderful a resemblance to the king himself, that Louis fancied he was looking at his own face reflected in a mirror, with the exception, however, that the face was saddened by a feeling of the profoundest pity. Then it seemed to him as if the dome gradually retired, escaping from his gaze, and that the figures and attributes painted by Lebrun became darker and darker, as the distance became more and more remote. A gentle, easy movement, as regular as that by which a vessel plunges beneath the waves, had succeeded to the immovableness of the bed. Doubtless the king was dreaming, and in this dream the crown of gold, which fastened the curtains together, seemed to recede from his vision, just as the dome to which it remained suspended had done, so that the winged genius which, with both its hands, supported the crown, seemed, though vainly so, to call upon the king, who was fast disappearing from it. The bed still sunk, Louis, with his eyes open, could not resist the deception of this cruel hallucination. At last, as the light of the royal chamber faded away into darkness and gloom, something cold, gloomy, and inexplicable in its nature seemed to infect the air. No paintings, nor gold, nor velvet hangings were visible any longer. Nothing but walls of a dull gray color, which the increasing gloom made darker every moment. And yet the bed still continued to descend, and after a minute, which seemed in its duration almost an age to the king, it reached a stratum of air, black and chill as death, and then it stopped. The king could no longer see the light in his room, except as from the bottom of a well we can see the light of day. "I am under the influence of some atrocious dream," he thought. "It is time to awaken from it. Come, let me wake." Everyone has experienced the sensation the above remark conveys. There is hardly a person who, in the midst of a nightmare, whose influence is suffocating, has not said to himself, by the help of that light which still burns in the brain when every human light is extinguished, "It is nothing but a dream after all." This was precisely what Louis XIV said to himself. But when he said, "Come, come, wake up," he perceived that not only was he already awake, but still more, that he had his eyes open also. And then he looked around him. On his right hand and on his left, 2 armed men stood in stolid silence, each wrapped in a huge cloak, and the face covered with a mask. One of them held a small lamp in his hand, whose glimmering light revealed the saddest picture a king could look upon. Louis could not help saying to himself that his dream still lasted, and that all he had to do was to cause it to disappear was to move his arms or to say something aloud. He darted from his bed and found himself upon the damp, moist ground. Then, addressing himself to the man who held the lamp in his hand, he said, "What is this, monsieur, and what is the meaning of this jest?" "It is no jest," replied the deep voice, the masked figure that held the lantern. "Do you belong to Monsieur Fouquet?" inquired the king, greatly astonished at the situation. "It matters very little to whom we belong," said the phantom. "We are your masters now. That is sufficient." The king, more impatient than intimidated, turned to the other masked figure. "If this is a comedy," he said, "you will tell Monsieur Fouquet that I find it unseemly and improper, and that I command it should cease." The second masked person, to whom the king had addressed himself, was a man of huge stature and vast circumference. He held himself erect and motionless as any block of marble. "Well, well," added the king, stamping his foot, "you do not answer." "We do not answer you, my good monsieur," said the giant in a stentorian voice, "because there is nothing to say." "At least tell me what you want," exclaimed Louis, folding his arms with a passionate gesture. "You will know by and by," replied the man who held the lamp. "In the meantime, tell me where I am." "Look." Louis looked all around him, but the light of the lamp, which the masked figure raised for the purpose, he could perceive nothing but the damp walls which glistened here and there with the slimy traces of the snail. "Oh, oh, a dungeon!" cried the king. "No, a subterranean passage." "Which leads—" "Will you be good enough to follow us?" "I shall not stir from hence," cried the king. "If you are obstinate, my dear young friend," replied the taller of the two, "I will lift you up in my arms and roll you up in your own cloak, and if you should happen to be stifled, why, so much the worse for you." As he said this, he disengaged from beneath his cloak a hand of which Milo of Crotona would have envied him in the possession on the day when he had that unhappy idea of rending his last oak. The king dreaded violence, for he could well believe that the 2 men into whose power he had fallen had not gone so far with any idea of drawing back, and that they would consequently be ready to proceed to extremities if necessary. He shook his head and said, "It seems I have fallen into the hands of a couple of assassins. Move on, then." Neither of the men answered a word to this remark. The one who carried the lantern walked first. The king followed him, while the second masked figure closed the procession. In this manner they passed along a winding gallery of some length, with as many staircases leading out of it as are to be found in the mysterious and gloomy palaces of Anne Radcliffe's creation. All these windings and turnings, during which the king heard the sound of running water over his head, ended at last in a long corridor, closed by an iron door. The figure with the lamp opened the door with one of the keys he wore suspended at his girdle, where, during the whole of the brief journey, the king had heard them rattle. As soon as the door was opened and admitted the air, Louis recognized the balmy odors that trees exhale in hot summer nights. He paused hesitatingly for a moment or two, but the huge sentinel who followed him thrust him out of the subterranean passage. "Another blow," said the king, turning towards the one who had just had the audacity to touch his sovereign. "What do you intend to do with the King of France?" "Try to forget that word," replied the man with the lamp in a tone which as little admitted of a reply as one of the famous decrees of Minos. "You deserve to be broken on the wheel for the words that you have just made use of," said the giant as he extinguished the lamp his companion handed to him. "But the king is too kind-hearted." Louis, at that threat, made so sudden a movement that it seemed as if he meditated flight, but the giant's hand was in a moment placed on his shoulder and fixed him motionless where he stood. But tell me at least where we are going," said the king. "Come," replied the former of the two men, with a kind of respect in his manner, and leading his prisoner toward a carriage which seemed to be waiting. The carriage was completely concealed amid the trees. Two horses, with their feet fettered, were fastened by a halter to lower the branches of a large oak. "Get in," said the same man, opening the carriage door and letting down the step. The king obeyed, seated himself at the back of the carriage, the padded door of which was shut and locked immediately upon him and his guide. As for the giant, he cut the fastenings by which the horses were bound, harnessed them himself, and mounted on the box of the carriage, which was unoccupied. The carriage set off immediately at a quick trot, turned into the road to Paris, and in the forest of Senart found a relay of horses fastened to the trees in the same manner the first horses had been, and without a postilion. The man on the box changed the horses and continued to follow the road towards Paris with the same rapidity, so that they entered the city about 3 o'clock in the morning. The carriage proceeded along the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, and after having called out to the sentinel, "By the king's order," the driver conducted the horses into the circular enclosure of the Bastille, looking out upon the courtyard, called La Cour du Gouvernement. There the horses drew up, reeking with sweat at the flight of steps, and a sergeant of the guard ran forward. "Go and wake the governor," said the coachman in a voice of thunder. With the exception of this voice, which might have been heard at the entrance of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, everything remained as calm in the carriage as in the prison. 10 minutes afterwards, Monsieur de Bassam appeared in his dressing gown on the threshold of the door. "What is the matter now?" he asked, "and whom have you brought me here?" The man with the lantern opened the carriage door and said 2 or 3 words to the one who acted as driver, who immediately got down from his seat, took up a short musket which he kept under his feet, and placed its muzzle on the prisoner's chest. "And fire at once, if he speaks," added aloud the man who alighted from the carriage. "Very good," replied his companion, without another remark. With this recommendation, the person who had accompanied the king in the carriage ascended the flight of steps, at the top of which the governor was awaiting him. "Monsieur d'Herblay," said the latter. "Hush," said Aramis. "Let us go into your room." "Good heavens, what brings you here at this hour?" "A mistake, my dear Monsieur de Bassam," Aramis replied quietly. "It appears that you were quite right the other day." "What about?" inquired the governor. About the order of release, my dear friend. Tell me what you mean, monsieur. No, monseigneur, said the governor, almost suffocated by surprise and terror. It is a very simple affair. You remember, dear Monsieur de Bassam, that an order of release was sent to you. Yes, for Marchiali. Very good. We both thought it was for Marchiali. Certainly. You will recollect, however, that I would not credit it, but that you compelled me to believe it. Oh, Bassam, my good fellow, what a word to make use of. Strongly recommended, that was all. Strongly recommended, yes. Strongly recommended to give him up to you, and that you carried him off with you in your carriage. Well, my dear Monsieur Bassam, it was a mistake. It was discovered at the ministry, so that now I bring you an order from the king to set at liberty Selden, that poor Selden fellow, you know. Selden, are you sure this time? Well, read it yourself, said Aramis, handing him the order. Why, said Bassam, this order is the very same that has already passed through my hands. Indeed. It is the very one, I assure you, I saw the other evening. Parbleu, I recognize it by the blot of ink. I do not know whether it is that, but all I know is that I bring it for you. But then, what about the other? What other? Marchiali. I have got him here with me, but that is not enough for me. I require a new order to take him back again. Don't talk such nonsense, my dear Bassam. You talk like a child. Where is the order you received respecting Marchiali? Bassam ran to his iron chest and took it out. Aramis seized hold of it, coolly tore it in 4 pieces, held them to the lamp, and burnt them. Good heavens, what are you doing? Exclaimed Bassam in an extremity of terror. Look at your position quietly, my good governor, said Aramis with imperturbable self-possession, and you will see how very simple the whole affair is. You no longer possess any order justifying Marchiali's release. I am a lost man. Far from it, my good fellow, since I have brought Marchiali back to you, and all accordingly is just the same as if he had never left. Ah, said the governor, completely overcome by terror. Plain enough, you see, and you will go and shut him up immediately. I should think so, indeed. And you will hand over this Selden to me, whose liberation is authorized by this order. Do you understand? You do understand, I see, said Aramis. Very good. Bassam clapped his hands together. But why, at all events, after having taken Marchiali away from me, do you bring him back again? Cried the unhappy governor in a paroxysm of terror and completely dumbfounded. For a friend such as you are, said Aramis. For so devoted a servant I have no secrets. And he put his mouth close to Bassam's ear as he said, in a low tone of voice, You know the resemblance between that unfortunate fellow and the king? Yes. Very good. The first use that Marchiali made of his liberty was to persist. Can you guess what? How is it likely I should guess? To persist in saying that he was the king of France, to dress himself up in clothes like those of the king, and then pretend to assume that he was the king himself. Gracious heavens! That is the reason why I have brought him back again, my dear friend. He is mad, and lets everyone see how mad he is. What is to be done, then? That is very simple. Let no one hold any communication with him. You understand that when his peculiar style of madness came to the king's ears, the king, who had pitied his terrible affliction and saw that all his kindness had been repaid by black ingratitude, became perfectly furious, so that now, and remember this very distinctly, dear Monsieur Bassam, for it concerns you most closely, so that there is now, I repeat, sentence of death pronounced against all those who may allow him to communicate with anyone else but me or the king himself. You understand, Bassam? Sentence of death. You need not ask me whether I understand. And now let us go down and conduct this poor devil back to his dungeon again, unless you prefer he should come up here." "What would be the good of that?" "It would be better, perhaps, to enter his name in the prison book at once." "Of course. Certainly, not a doubt of it." "In that case, have him up." Bassam ordered the drums to be beaten and the bell to be rung as a warning to everyone to retire, in order to avoid meeting a prisoner about whom it was desired to observe a certain mystery. Then, when the passages were free, he went to take the prisoner from the carriage, at whose breast Porthos, faithful to the directions which had been given him, still kept his musket levelled. "Ah, is that you, you miserable wretch?" cried the governor as soon as he perceived the king. "Very good, very good." And immediately, making the king get out of the carriage, he led him, still accompanied by Porthos, who had not taken off his mask, and Aramis, who again resumed his, up the stairs to the second Bertaudiere, and opened the door of the room in which Philippe for 6 long years had bemoaned his existence. The king entered the cell without pronouncing a single word. He faltered in, as limp and haggard as a rain-struck lily. Bassam shut the door upon him, turned the key twice in the lock, and then returned to Aramis. "It is quite true," he said in a low tone, "that he bears a striking resemblance to the king, but less so than you said." "So that," said Aramis, "you would not have been deceived by the substitution of the one for the other?" "What a question! You are a most valuable fellow, Bassam," said Aramis. "And now set Selden free." "Oh, yes, I was going to forget that. I will go and give orders at once." "Bah, tomorrow will be time enough." "Tomorrow? Oh, no, this very minute." "Well, go off to your affairs. I will go away to mine. But it is quite understood, is it not?" "What is quite understood?" "That no one is to enter the prisoner's cell except with an order from the king, an order which I will myself bring." "Quite so. Adieu, monseigneur." Aramis returned to his companion. "Now, Porthos, my good fellow, back again to Vaux, and as fast as possible." "A man is light and easy enough when he has faithfully served his king, and, in serving him, saved his country," said Porthos. "The horses will be as light as if our tissues were constructed of wind itself. So let us be off." And the carriage, lightened of a prisoner, who might well be, as he in fact was, very heavy in the sight of Aramis, passed across the broad drawbridge of the Bastille, which was raised again immediately behind it. Chapter 18. A Night at the Bastille. Pain and anguish and suffering in human life are always in proportion to the strength with which a man is endowed. We will not pretend to say heaven was always apportions to a man's capability of endurance the anguish with which he inflicts him, for that, indeed, would not be true, since heaven permits the existence of death, which is sometimes the only refuge open to those who are too closely pressed, too bitterly afflicted. As far as the body is concerned, suffering is in proportion to the strength which has been accorded. In other words, the weak suffer more, where the trial is the same, than the strong. And what are the elementary principles, we may ask, that compose human strength? It is not, more than anything else, exercise, habit, experience. We shall not even take the trouble to demonstrate this, for it is an axiom in morals, as in physics. When the young king, stupefied and crushed in every sense and feeling, found himself led to a cell in the Bastille, he fancied death itself is but a sleep, that it, too, has its dreams as well, and that the bed had broken through the flooring of his room at Vaux, that death had resulted from the occurrence, and that, still carrying out his dream, the king, Louis XIV, now no longer living, was dreaming one of those horrors, impossible to realize in life, which is termed dethronement, imprisonment, and insult towards a sovereign who formerly wielded unlimited power. To be present at, an actual witness to, of this bitterness of death, to float indecisively in an incomprehensible mystery between resemblance and reality, to hear everything, to see everything, without interfering in a single detail of agonizing suffering, was, so the king thought within himself, a torture far more terrible, since it might last forever. "Is this what is termed eternity? Hell?" he murmured, at the moment the door was closed upon him, which we remember Bassam had shut with his own hands. He did not even look round him, and in the room, leaning with his back against the wall, he allowed himself to be carried away by the terrible supposition that he was already dead. As he closed his eyes in order to avoid looking upon something even worse still, "How can I have died?" he said to himself, sick with terror. "The bed might have been let down by some artificial means, but no, I do not remember to have felt a bruise, nor any shock either. Would they not rather have poisoned me at my meals, or with the fumes of wax, as they did my ancestress, Jeanne d'Albret?" Suddenly the chill of the dungeons seemed to fall like a wet cloak upon Louis's shoulders. "I have seen," he said, "my father lying dead upon his funeral couch, in his regal robes, that pale face so calm and worn, those hands, once so skilful, lying nerveless by his side, those limbs stiffened by the icy grasp of death. Nothing there betokened a sleep that was disturbed by dreams. And yet, how numerous were the dreams which heaven might have sent that royal corpse. Him who so many others had preceded, hurried away by him into eternal death. No, that king was still the king. He was enthroned still upon that funeral couch, as upon a velvet armchair. He had not abdicated one title of his majesty. God, who had not punished him, will not punish me, who have done nothing. A strange sound attracted the young man's attention. He looked round him and saw on the mantel-shelf, just below an enormous crucifix, coarsely painted in fresco on the wall, a rat of enormous size, engaged in nibbling a piece of dry bread, but fixing all the time an intelligent and inquiring look upon the new occupant of the cell. The king could not resist a sudden impulse of fear and disgust. He moved back towards the door, uttering a loud cry, and as if he but needed this cry, which escaped from his breast almost unconsciously, to recognize himself, Louis knew that he was alive, and in full possession of his natural senses. "A prisoner!" he cried. I, a prisoner!" He looked round him for a bell to summon someone to him. "There are no bells in the Bastille," he said, "and it is in the Bastille I am imprisoned. In what way can I have been made a prisoner? It must have been owing to a conspiracy of Monsieur Fouquet. I have been drawn to Vaux as to a snare. Monsieur Fouquet cannot be acting alone in this affair. His agent, that voice that I but just now heard, was Monsieur d'Herblay. I recognize it. Colbert was right, then. But what is Fouquet's object? To reign in my place and stead? Impossible. Yet who knows?" thought the king, relapsing into gloom again. "Perhaps my brother, the Duc d'Orleans, is doing that which my uncle wished to do during the whole of his life against my father. But the queen, my mother too, and La Valliere, oh, La Valliere, she will have been abandoned to Madame. Dear, dear girl, yes it is. It must be so. They have shut her up as they have me. We are separated forever." And at this idea of separation the poor lover burst into a flood of tears and sobs and groans. "There is a governor in this place," the king continued in a fury of passion. "I will speak to him. I will summon him to me." He called. No voice replied to his. He seized hold of his chair and hurled it against the massive oaken door. The wood resounded against the door and awakened many a mournful echo in the profound depths of the staircase, but from a human creature, none. This was a fresh proof for the king of the slight regard in which he was held at the Bastille. Therefore, when his first fit of anger had passed away, having remarked a barred window through which there passed a stream of light, lozenge-shaped, which must be, he knew, the bright orb of approaching day, Louis began to call out, at first gently enough, then louder and louder still, but no one replied. 20 other attempts which he made, one after another, obtained no other or better success. His blood began to boil within him and mount to his head. His nature was such that, accustomed to command, he trembled at the idea of disobedience. The prisoner broke the chair, which was too heavy for him to lift, and made use of it as a battering ram to strike against the door. He struck so loudly and so repeatedly that the perspiration soon began to pour down his face. The sound became tremendous and continuous. Certain stifled, smothered cries replied in different directions. This sound produced a strange effect upon the king. He paused to listen to it. It was the voices of the prisoners, formerly his victims, now his companions. The voices ascended like vapors through the thick ceilings and the massive walls, and rose in accusations against the author of this noise, as doubtless their sighs and tears accused, in whispered tones, the author of their captivity. After having deprived so many people of their liberty, the king came among them to rob them of their rest. This idea almost drove him mad. It redoubled his strength, or rather his will, bent upon obtaining some information or a conclusion to the affair. With a portion of the broken chair, he recommenced the noise. At the end of an hour, Louis heard something in the corridor, behind the door of his cell, and a violent blow, which was returned upon the door itself, made him cease his own. "Are you mad?" said a rude, brutal voice. "What is the matter with you this morning?" "This morning," thought the king, but he said aloud, politely, "Monsieur, are you the governor of the Bastille?" "My good fellow, your head is out of sorts," replied the voice. "But that is no reason why you should make such a terrible disturbance. Be quiet, mordieu." "Are you the governor?" the king inquired again. He heard a door on the corridor close. The jailer had just left, not condescending to reply a single word. When the king had assured himself of his departure, his fury no longer knew any bounds. As agile as a tiger, he leapt from the table to the window and struck the iron bars with all his might. He broke a pane of glass, the pieces of which fell clanking into the courtyard below. He shouted with increasing hoarseness, "The governor! The governor!" This excess lasted fully an hour, during which time he was in a burning fever, with his hair in disorder and matted on his forehead, his dress torn and covered with dust and plaster, his linen in shreds. The king never rested until his strength was utterly exhausted, and it was not until then that he clearly understood the pitiless thickness of the walls, the impenetrable nature of the cement, invincible to every influence but that of time, and he possessed no other weapon but despair. He leaned his forehead against the door and let the feverish throbbings of his heart calm by degrees. It had seemed as if one single additional pulsation would have made it burst. A moment will come when the food which is given to the prisoners will be brought to me. I shall then see someone. I shall speak to him and get an answer. And the king tried to remember at what hour the first repast of the prisoners was served at the Bastille. He was ignorant even of this detail. The feeling of remorse at this remembrance smote him like the thrust of a dagger, that he should have lived for 25 years a king and in the enjoyment of every happiness, without having bestowed a moment's thought on the misery of those who had been unjustly deprived of their liberty. The king blushed for very shame. He felt that heaven, in permitting this fearful humiliation, did no more than render to the man the same torture as had been inflicted by that man upon so many others. Nothing could be more efficacious for reawakening his mind to religious influences than the prostration of his heart and mind and soul beneath the feeling of such acute wretchedness. But Louis dared not even kneel in prayer to God to entreat him to terminate his bitter soul. "Heaven is right," he said. "Heaven acts wisely. It would be cowardly to pray to heaven for that which I have so often refused my own fellow creatures." He had reached this stage of his reflections, that is, of his agony of mind, when a similar noise was again heard behind his door, followed this time by the sound of the key in the lock, and of the bolts being withdrawn from their staples. The king bounded forward to be nearer to the person who was about to enter, but suddenly reflecting that it was a movement unworthy of a sovereign, he paused, assumed a noble and calm expression, which for him was easy enough, and waited with his back turned towards the window, in order, to some extent, to conceal his agitation from the eyes of the person who was about to enter. It was only a jailer with a basket of provisions. The king looked at the man with restless anxiety and waited until he spoke. "Ah," said the latter, "you have broken your chair. I said you had done so. Why, you have gone quite mad." "Monsieur," said the king, "be careful what you say. It will be a very serious affair for you." The jailer placed the basket on the table and looked at his prisoner steadily. "What do you say?" he said. "Desire the governor to come to me," added the king in accents of full calm and dignity. "Come, my boy," said the turnkey. "You have always been very quiet and reasonable, but you are getting vicious, it seems, and I wish you to know it in time. You have broken your chair and made a great disturbance. That is an offence punishable by imprisonment in one of the lower dungeons. Promise me not to begin over again, and I will not say a word about it to the governor." "I wish to see the governor," replied the king, still governing his passions. "He will send you off to one of the dungeons, I tell you, so take care." "I insist upon it. Do you hear?" Ah, your eyes are becoming wild again. Very good, I shall take away your knife." And the jailer did what he said, quitted the prisoner, and closed the door, leaving the king more astounded, more wretched, more isolated than ever. It was useless, though he tried, to make the same noise again on his door, and equally useless that he threw the plates and dishes out of the window. Not a single sound was heard in recognition. 2 hours afterwards he could not be recognized as a king, a gentleman, a man, a human being. He might rather be called a madman, tearing the door with his nails, trying to tear up the flooring of his cell, and uttering such wild and fearful cries that the old Bastille seemed to tremble to its very foundations for having revolted against its master. As for the governor, the jailer did not even think of disturbing him. The turnkeys and the sentinels had reported the occurrence to him, but what was the good of it? Were not these madmen common enough in such a prison? And were not the walls still stronger? Monsieur de Bassam, thoroughly impressed with what Aramis had told him, and in perfect conformity with the king's order, hoped only that one thing might happen, namely, that the madman Marchiali might be mad enough to hang himself to the canopy of his bed, or to one of the bars of the window. In fact, the prisoner was anything but a profitable investment for Monsieur Bassam, and became more annoying than agreeable to him. These complications of Seldon and Marchiali, the complications first of setting at liberty and then imprisoning again, the complications arising from the strong likeness in question, had at last found a very proper denouement. Bassam even thought he had remarked that D'Herblay himself was not altogether dissatisfied with the result. "And then, really," said Bassam to his next in command, "an ordinary prisoner is already unhappy enough in being a prisoner. He suffers quite enough, indeed, to induce one to hope, charitably enough, that his death may not be far distant, with still greater reason, accordingly, when the prisoner has gone mad, and might bite and make a terrible disturbance in the Bastille. Why, in such a case, it is not simply an act of mere charity to wish him dead. It would be almost a good and even commendable action, quietly, to have him put out of his misery." And the good-natured governor thereupon sat down to his late breakfast. Chapter 19. The Shadow of Monsieur Fouquet. D'Artagnan, still confused and oppressed by the conversation he had just had with the king, could not resist asking himself if he were really in possession of his senses, if he were really and truly at Vaux, if he, D'Artagnan, were really the captain of the Musketeers, and Monsieur Fouquet the owner of the chateau in which, Louis XIV was at that moment partaking of his hospitality. These reflections were not those of a drunken man, although everything was in prodigal profusion at Vaux, and the superintendent's wines had met with a distinguished reception at the fete. The Gascon, however, was a man of calm self-possession, and no sooner did he touch his bright steel blade than he knew how to adopt morally the cold, keen weapon as his guide of action. "Well," he said, as he quitted the royal apartment, "I seem now to be mixed up historically with the destinies of the king and of the minister. It will be written that Monsieur d'Artagnan, a younger son of a Gascon family, placed his hand on the shoulder of Monsieur Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of the finances of France. My descendants, if I have any, will flatter themselves with the distinction which this arrest will confer, just as the members of the de Luynes family have done with regard to the estates of the poor Maréchal d'Ancre. But the thing is, how best to execute the king's directions in a proper manner. Any man would know how to say to Monsieur Fouquet, 'Your sword, monsieur.' But it is not everyone who would be able to take care of Monsieur Fouquet without others knowing anything about it. How am I to manage, then, so that Monsieur le Superintendent pass from the height of favor to the direst disgrace, that Vaux be turned into a dungeon for him, and that after having been steeped to his lips, as it were, in all the perfumes and incenses of Aramis, he is transferred to the gallows of Haman. In other words, of Enguerrand de Marigny." And at this reflection D'Artagnan's brow became clouded with perplexity. The musketeer had certain scruples on the matter, it must be admitted, to deliver up to death, for not a doubt existed that Louis hated Fouquet mortally. The man who had just shown himself so delightful and charming a host in every way was a real insult to one's conscience. "It almost seems," said D'Artagnan to himself, "that if I am not a poor, mean, miserable fellow, I should let Monsieur Fouquet know the opinion the king has about him. Yet if I betray my master's secret, I shall be a false-hearted, treacherous knave, a traitor, too, a crime provided for and punishable by military laws. So much so, indeed, that 20 times in former days, when wars were rife, I have seen many a miserable fellow strung up to a tree for doing, in but a small degree, what my scruples counsel me to undertake upon a great scale now. No, I think that a man of true readiness of wit ought to get out of this difficulty with more skill than that. And now, let us admit that I do possess a little readiness of invention. It is not at all certain, though, for after having for 40 years absorbed so large a quantity, I shall be lucky if there were to be a pistole's worth left." D'Artagnan buried his head in his hands, tore his moustache in sheer vexation, and added, "What can be the reason of Monsieur Fouquet's disgrace? There seem to be 3 good ones. The first, because Monsieur Colbert doesn't like him. The second, because he wished to fall in love with Mademoiselle de la Valliere, and lastly, because the king likes Monsieur Colbert and loves Mademoiselle de la Valliere. Oh, but he is lost. But I shall put my foot on his neck, I, of all men, when he is falling a prey to the intrigues of a pack of women and clerks. For shame! If he be dangerous, I will lay him low enough. If, however, he only be persecuted, I will look on. I have come to such a decisive determination that neither king nor living man shall change my mind. If Athos were here, he would do as I have done. Therefore, instead of going in cold blood up to Monsieur Fouquet and arresting him offhand and shutting him up altogether, I will try and conduct myself like a man who understands what good manners are. People will talk about it, of course, but they shall talk well of it, I am determined." And D'Artagnan, drawing by a gesture peculiar to himself his shoulder belt over his shoulder, went straight off to Monsieur Fouquet, who, after he had taken leave of his guests, was preparing to retire for the night and to sleep tranquilly after the triumphs of the day. The air was still perfumed, or infected, whichever way it may be considered, with the odors of the torches and the fireworks. The wax lights were dying away in their sockets. The flowers fell unfastened from the garlands. The groups of dancers and courtiers were separating in the salons. Surrounded by his friends, who complimented him and received his flattering remarks in return, the superintendent half closed his wearied eyes. He longed for a rest and quiet. He sank upon the bed of laurels which had been heaped up for him so many days past. It might almost have been said that he seemed bowed beneath the weight of the new debts which he had incurred for the purpose of giving this greatest possible honor to this feat. Fouquet had just retired to his room, still smiling, but more than half asleep. He could listen to nothing more. He could hardly keep his eyes open. His bed seemed to possess a fascinating and irresistible attraction for him. The god Morpheus, the presiding deity of the dome painted by Lebrun, had extended his influence over the adjoining rooms and showered down his most sleep-inducing poppies upon the master of the house. Fouquet, almost entirely alone, was being assisted by his valet de chambre to undress, when Monsieur d'Artagnan appeared at the entrance of the room. D'Artagnan had never been able to succeed in making himself common at the court, and notwithstanding he was seen everywhere and on all occasions, he never failed to produce an effect wherever and whenever he made his appearance. Such is the happy privilege of certain natures, which in that respect resemble either thunder or lightning. Everyone recognizes them, but their appearance never fails to arouse surprise and astonishment. And whenever they occur, the impression is always left that the last was the most conspicuous or the most important. "What, Monsieur d'Artagnan?" asked Fouquet, who had already taken his right arm out of the sleeve of his doublet. "At your service," replied the Musketeer. "Come in, my dear Monsieur d'Artagnan." "Thank you." "Have you come to criticize the feat? You are ingenious enough in your criticisms, I know." "By no means." "Are not your men looked after properly?" "In every way." "You are not comfortably lodged, perhaps?" "Nothing could be better." "In that case I have to thank you for being so amiably disposed, and I must not fail to express my obligations to you for all your flattering kindness." These words were as much as to say, "My dear D'Artagnan, pray go to bed, since you have a bed to lie down on, and let me do the same." D'Artagnan did not seem to understand it. "Are you going to bed already?" he said to the superintendent. "Yes. Have you anything to say to me?" "Nothing, monsieur, nothing at all. You sleep in this room, then?" "Yes, as you see." "You have given a most charming fete to the king." "Do you think so?" "Oh, beautiful. Is the king pleased?" "Enchanted." "Did he desire you to say as much to me?" "He would not choose so unworthy a messenger, monseigneur." "You do not do yourself justice, Monsieur d'Artagnan." "Is that your bed there?" "Yes, but why do you ask? Are you not satisfied with your own?" "May I speak frankly to you?" "Most assuredly." "Well, then, I am not." Fouquet started, and then replied, Will you take my room, Monsieur d'Artagnan?" "What, deprive you of it, monseigneur? Never." "What am I to do, then?" "Allow me to share yours with you." Fouquet looked at the Musketeer fixedly. Ah, he said, "you have just left the king." "I have, monseigneur." "And the king wishes you to pass the night in my room?" "Monseigneur." "Very well, Monsieur d'Artagnan, very well. You are the master here." I assure you, Monseigneur, that I do not wish to abuse. Fouquet turned to his valet and said, Leave us. When the man had left, he said to D'Artagnan, You have something to say to me? Aye. A man of your superior intelligence cannot have come to talk with a man like myself at such an hour as the present without grave motives. Do not interrogate me. On the contrary, what do you want with me? Nothing more than the pleasure of your society. Come into the garden, then, said the superintendent suddenly, or into the park. No, replied the musketeer hastily. No. Why? The fresh air. Come, admit at once that you arrest me, said the superintendent to the captain. Never, said the latter. You intend to look after me, then? Yes, Monseigneur, I do, upon my honor. Upon your honor? Ah, that is quite another thing. So I am to be arrested in my own house. Do not say such a thing. On the contrary, I will proclaim it aloud. If you do so, I shall be compelled to request you to be silent. Very good. Violence towards me, and in my own house, too. We do not seem to understand one another at all. Stay a moment. There is a chessboard there. We will have a game, if you have no objections. Monsieur d'Artagnan, I am in disgrace, then? Not at all, but I am prohibited, I suppose, from withdrawing from your sight. I do not understand a word you are saying, Monseigneur, and if you wish me to withdraw, tell me so. My dear Monsieur d'Artagnan, your mode of action is enough to drive me mad. I was almost sinking for want of sleep, but you have completely awakened me. I shall never forgive myself, I am sure, and if you wish to reconcile me with myself, why, go to sleep in your bed in my presence, and I shall be delighted. I am under surveillance, I see. I will leave the room if you say any such thing. You are beyond my comprehension. Good night, Monseigneur, said D'Artagnan, as he pretended to withdraw. Fouquet ran after him. I will not lie down, he said. Seriously, and since you refuse to treat me as a man, and since you finesse with me, I will try and set you at bay, as a hunter does a wild boar. Bah! Cried D'Artagnan, pretending to smile. I shall order my horses and set off for Paris, said Fouquet, sounding the captain of the Musketeers. If that be the case, Monseigneur, it is very difficult. You will arrest me, then? No, but I shall go along with you. That is quite sufficient, Monsieur d'Artagnan, returned Fouquet coldly. It was not for nothing you acquired your reputation as a man of intelligence and resource. But with me all this is quite superfluous. Let us come to the point. Do me a service. Why do you arrest me? What have I done? Oh, I know nothing about what you may have done, but I do not arrest you. This evening, at least. This evening, said Fouquet, turning pale. But tomorrow? It is not tomorrow just yet, Monseigneur. Who can ever answer for the morrow? Quick, quick, Captain, let me speak to Monsieur d'Herblay. Alas, that is quite impossible, Monseigneur. I have strict orders that you hold no communication with anyone. With Monsieur d'Herblay, Captain? With your friend? Monseigneur, Monsieur d'Herblay is the only person with whom you ought to be prevented holding any communication. Fouquet colored, and then, assuming an air of resignation, he said, You are right, Monseigneur. You have taught me a lesson I ought not to have evoked. A fallen man cannot assert his right to anything, even from those whose fortunes he may have made. For a still stronger reason, he cannot claim anything from those to whom he may never have had the happiness of doing a service. Monseigneur, it is perfectly true, Monsieur d'Artagnan. You have always acted in the most admirable manner towards me, in such a manner, indeed, as most becomes the man who is destined to arrest me. You, at least, have never asked me anything. Monsieur, replied the Gascon. touched by his eloquent and noble tone of grief. "Will you, I ask it as a favor, pledge me your word as a man of honor that you will not leave this room?" "What is the use of it, dear Monsieur d'Artagnan, since you keep watch and ward over me? Do you suppose I should contend against the most valiant sword in the kingdom?" "It is not that at all, Monseigneur, but that I am going to look for Monsieur d'Herblay, and consequently to leave you alone." Fouquet uttered a cry of delight and surprise. "To look for Monsieur d'Herblay, to leave me alone!" he exclaimed, clasping his hands together. "Which is Monsieur d'Herblay's room? The blue room, is it not?" "Yes, my friend, yes." "Your friend. Thank you for that word, Monseigneur. You confer it upon me today, at least, if you have never done so before." "Ah, you have saved me." "It will take a good 10 minutes to go from hence to the blue room and to return," said D'Artagnan. "Nearly so. And then to wake Aramis, who sleeps very soundly when he is asleep. I put that down at another 5 minutes, making a total of 15 minutes' absence. And now, Monseigneur, give me your word that you will not in any way attempt to make your escape, and that when I return I shall find you here again." "I give it, monsieur," replied Fouquet, with an expression of the warmest and deepest gratitude. D'Artagnan disappeared. Fouquet looked at him as he quitted the room, waited with a feverish impatience until the door was closed behind him, and as soon as it was shut, flew to his keys, opened 2 or 3 secret doors concealed in various articles of furniture in the room, looked vainly for certain papers which doubtless he had left at Saint Mande, and which he seemed to regret not having found in them. Then, hurriedly seizing hold of letters, contracts, papers, writings, he heaped them up into a pile which he burnt in the extremest haste upon the marble hearth of the fireplace, not even taking time to draw from the interior of it the vases and pots of flowers with which it was filled. As soon as he had finished, like a man who had just escaped an imminent danger and whose strength abandons him as soon as the danger is past, he sank down, completely overcome, on a couch. When D'Artagnan returned, he found Fouquet in the same position. The worthy Musketeer had not the slightest doubt that Fouquet, having given his word, would not even think of failing to keep it, but he had thought it most likely that Fouquet would turn his, D'Artagnan's, absence to the best advantage in getting rid of all the papers, memorandums, and contracts which might possibly render his position, which was even now serious enough, more dangerous than ever. And so, lifting up his head like a dog who has regained the scent, he perceived an odor resembling smoke he had relied on finding in the atmosphere, and having found it, he made a movement of his head in token of satisfaction. As D'Artagnan entered, Fouquet on his side raised his head, and not one of D'Artagnan's movements escaped him. And then the looks of the 2 men met, and they both saw that they had understood each other without exchanging a syllable. "Well," asked Fouquet of the first to speak, "and Monsieur d'Herblay?" "Upon my word, Monseigneur," replied D'Artagnan, "Monsieur d'Herblay must be desperately fond of walking out at night and composing verses by moonlight in the park of Vaux with some of your poets, in all probability, for he is not in his own room." "What, not in his own room?" cried Fouquet, whose last hope thus escaped him, for unless he could ascertain in what way the Bishop of Vannes could assist him, he perfectly well knew that he could expect assistance from no other quarter. "Or, indeed," continued D'Artagnan, "if he is in his own room, he has very good reasons for not answering." "But surely you did not call him in such a manner that he could have heard you." "You can hardly suppose, Monseigneur, that having already exceeded my orders, which forbade me leaving you a single moment, you can hardly suppose, I say, that I should have been mad enough to rouse the whole house, and allow myself to be seen in the corridor of the Bishop of Vannes, in order that Monsieur Colbert might state with positive certainty that I gave you time to burn your papers." "My papers? Of course, at least that is what I should have done in your place. When anyone opens a door for me, I always avail myself of it." "Yes, yes, and I thank you, for I have availed myself of it. And you have done perfectly right. Every man has his own peculiar secrets, with which others have nothing to do. But let us return to Aramis, Monseigneur. Well, then, I tell you, you could not have called loud enough, or Aramis would have heard you. However softly anyone may call Aramis, Monseigneur, Aramis always hears when he has an interest in hearing. I repeat what I said before, Aramis was not in his own room, or Aramis had certain reasons for not recognizing my voice, of which I am ignorant, and of which you may be even ignorant yourself, notwithstanding your liegeman and his greatness, the Lord Bishop of Vannes. Fouquet drew a deep sigh, rose from his seat, took 3 or 4 turns in his room, and finished by seating himself with an expression of extreme dejection upon his magnificent bed, with velvet hangings and costliest lace. D'Artagnan looked at Fouquet with feelings of the deepest and sincerest pity. "I have seen a good many men arrested in my life," said the Musketeer, sadly. "I have seen both Monsieur de Cinq-Mars and Monsieur de Chalais arrested, though I was very young then. I have seen Monsieur de Conde arrested with the Princess. I have seen Monsieur de Retz arrested, and have seen Monsieur Brussels arrested. Stay a moment, Monseigneur, it is agreeable to have to say, but the very one of all these whom you most resemble at this moment is that poor fellow Brussels. You were very near doing as he did, putting your dinner napkin in your portfolio and wiping your mouth with your papers. Mordieu! Monseigneur Fouquet, a man like you ought not to be dejected in this manner. Suppose your friends saw you." "Monsieur d'Artagnan," returned the superintendent with a smile full of gentleness, "you do not understand me. It is precisely because my friends are not looking on that I am as you see me now. I do not live, even exist, isolated from others. I am nothing when left to myself. Understand that throughout my whole life I have passed every moment of my time in making friends whom I hoped to render my stay and support. In times of prosperity, all these cheerful, happy voices, rendered so through by and my means, formed in my honor a concert of praise and kindly actions. In the least disfavor, these humbler voices accompanied in harmonious accents the murmur of my own heart. Isolation I have never yet known. Poverty, a phantom I have sometimes beheld, clad in rags, awaiting me at the end of my journey through life. Poverty has been the spectre with which many of my own friends have trifled for years past, which they poetize and caress, and which has attracted me towards them. Poverty, I accept it, acknowledge it, receive it as a disinherited sister, for poverty is neither solitude, nor exile, nor imprisonment. It is likely I shall ever be poor, with such friends as Pelisson, as La Fontaine, as Molière, with such a mistress as so, if you knew how utterly lonely and desolate I feel at this moment, and how you, who separate me from all I love, seem to resemble the image of solitude, of annihilation, of death itself." "But I have already told you, Monsieur Fouquet," replied D'Artagnan, moved to the depths of his soul, "that you are woefully exaggerating. The king likes you." "No, no," said Fouquet, shaking his head. "Monsieur Colbert hates you." "Monsieur Colbert, what does that matter to me?" "He will ruin you." "Ah, I defy him to do that, for I am ruined already." At this singular confession of the superintendent, D'Artagnan cast his glance all around the room, and although he did not open his lips, Fouquet understood him so thoroughly that he added, "What can be done with such wealth of substance as surrounds us, when a man can no longer cultivate his taste for the magnificent? Do you know what good the greater part of the wealth and the possessions which we rich enjoy confer upon us? Merely to disgust us, by their very splendor even, with everything which does not equal it. Vaux, you will say, and the wonders of Vaux, what of it? What boot these wonders? If I am ruined, how shall I fill with water the urns which my naiads bear in their arms, or force the air into the lungs of my Tritons? To be rich enough, Monsieur d'Artagnan, a man must be too rich. D'Artagnan shook his head. Oh, I know very well what you think, replied Fouquet quickly. If Vaux were yours, you would sell it and would purchase an estate in the country, an estate which should have woods, orchards, and lands attached, so that the estate should be made to support its master. With 40 millions you might— 10 millions, interrupted D'Artagnan. Not a million, not a million, my dear captain. No one in France is rich enough to give 2 millions for Vaux, and to continue to maintain it as I have done. No one could do it, and no one would know how. Well, said D'Artagnan, in any case, 1 million is not abject misery. It is not far from it, my dear monsieur. But you do not understand me. No, I will not sell my residence at Vaux. I will give it to you, if you like. And Fouquet accompanied these words with a movement of the shoulders, to which it would be impossible to do justice. Give it to the king, and you will make a better bargain. The king does not require me to give it to him, said Fouquet. He will take it away from me with the most absolute ease and grace, if it pleases him to do so, and that is the very reason I should prefer to see it perish. Do you know, Monsieur d'Artagnan, that if the king did not happen to be under my roof, I would take this candle, go straight to the dome, and set fire to a couple of huge chests of fusees and fireworks which are in reserve there, and would reduce my palace to ashes. Bah, said the Musketeer negligently. At all events, you would not be able to burn the gardens, and that is the finest feature of the place. And yet, resumed Fouquet thoughtfully, what was I saying? Great heavens! Burn Vaux, destroy my palace! But Vaux is not mine. These wonderful creations are, it is true, the property, as far as sense of enjoyment goes, of the man who has paid for them, but as far as duration is concerned, they belong to those who created them. Vaux belongs to Lebrun, to Lenotre, to Pelisson, to Lavaux, to La Fontaine, to Molière. Vaux belongs to posterity. In fact, you see, Monsieur d'Artagnan, that my very house has ceased to be my own. That is all well and good, said D'Artagnan. The idea is agreeable enough, and I recognize Monsieur Fouquet himself in it. That idea, indeed, makes me forget that poor fellow Broussel altogether, and now I fail to recognize you in you the whining complaints of that old Frondeur. If you are ruined, monsieur, look at the affair manfully, for you too, mordieu, belong to posterity, and have no right to lessen yourself in any way. Stay a moment, look at me, I, who seem to exercise in some degree a kind of superiority over you, because I am arresting you. Fate, which distributes their different parts to the comedians of this world, accorded me a less agreeable and less advantageous part to fill than yours has been. I am one of those who think that the parts which kings and powerful nobles are called upon to act are infinitely of more worth than the parts of beggars or lackeys. It is far better on the stage, I mean, of another theatre than the theatre of this world. It is far better to wear a fine coat and to talk a fine language than to walk the boards shod with a pair of old shoes, or to get one's backbone gently polished by a hearty dressing with a stick. In one word, you have been a prodigal with money. You have ordered and been obeyed, have been steeped to the lips in enjoyment, while I have dragged my tether after me, have been commanded and have obeyed, and have drudged my life away. Well, although I may seem of such trifling importance beside you, monseigneur, I do declare to you that the recollection of what I have done serves me as a spur and prevents me from bowing my old head too soon. I shall remain unto the very end a trooper, and when my turn comes I shall fall perfectly straight, all in a heap, still alive, after having selected my place beforehand. Do as I do, Monsieur Fouquet. You will not find yourself the worse for it. A fall happens only once in a lifetime to men like yourself, and the chief thing is to take it gracefully when the chance presents itself. There is a Latin proverb, the words escape me, but I remember the sense of it very well, for I have thought over it more than once, which says, "The end crowns the work." Fouquet rose from his seat, passed his arm round D'Artagnan's neck, and clasped him in a close embrace, whilst the other hand he presented his hand. "An excellent homily," he said, after a moment's pause. "A soldier's, Monseigneur. You have a regard for me in telling me all that." "Perhaps." Fouquet resumed his pensive attitude once more, and then, a moment after, he said, "Where can Monsieur d'Herblay be? I dare not ask you to send for him." "You would not ask me, because I would not do it, Monsieur Fouquet. People would learn it, and Aramis, who is not mixed up with the affair, might possibly be compromised and included in your disgrace." "I will wait here till daylight," said Fouquet. "Yes, that is best." "What shall we do when daylight comes?" "I know nothing at all about it, Monseigneur." "Monsieur d'Artagnan, will you do me a favor?" "Most willingly." "You guard me. I remain. You are acting in the full discharge of your duty, I suppose?" "Certainly." "Very good, then. Remain as close to me as my shadow, if you like, and I infinitely prefer such a shadow to anyone else." D'Artagnan bowed to the compliment. "But alas! Forget that you are Monsieur d'Artagnan, captain of the Musketeers. Forget that I am Monsieur Fouquet, superintendent of the finances, and let us talk about my affairs. That is a rather delicate subject." "Indeed." "Yes, but for your sake, Monsieur Fouquet, I will do what may almost be regarded as an impossibility." "Thank you. What did the king say to you?" "Nothing." "Ah, is that the way you talk?" "The deuce." "What do you think of my situation?" "I do not know." "However, unless you have some ill feeling against me." "Your position is a difficult one." "In what respect?" "Because you are under your own roof." "However difficult it may be, I understand it very well." "Do you suppose that, with anyone else but yourself, I should have shown so much frankness?" "What? So much frankness, do you say? You who refuse to tell me the slightest thing?" "At all events, then, so much ceremony and consideration." "Ah, I have nothing to say in that respect." "One moment, Monseigneur. Let me tell you how I should have behaved towards anyone but yourself. It might be that I happened to arrive at your door just as your guests or your friends had left you, or if they had not gone yet, I should wait until they were leaving, and should then catch them one after the other, like rabbits. I should lock them up quietly enough. I should steal softly along the carpet of your corridor, and, with one hand upon you, before you suspected the slightest thing amiss, I should keep you safely until my master's breakfast in the morning. In this way I should just the same have avoided all publicity, all disturbance, all opposition, but there would also have been no warning for Monsieur Fouquet, no consideration for his feelings, none of those delicate concessions which are shown by persons who are essentially courteous in their natures, whenever the decisive moment may arrive. Are you satisfied with the plan?" "It makes me shudder." "I thought you would not like it. It would have been very disagreeable to have made my appearance tomorrow without any preparation, and to have asked you to deliver up your sword." "Oh, monsieur, I should have died of shame and anger." "Your gratitude is too eloquently expressed. I have not done enough to deserve it, I assure you." "Most certainly, monsieur, you will never get me to believe that." "Well, then, monseigneur, if you are satisfied with what I have done, and have somewhat recovered from the shock which I prepared you for as much as I possibly could, let us allow the few hours that remain to pass away undisturbed. You are harassed, and should arrange your thoughts. I beg you, therefore, go to sleep, or pretend to go to sleep, either on your bed or in your bed. I will sleep in this armchair, and when I fall asleep, my rest is so sound that a cannon would not awake me." Fouquet smiled. I expect, however, continued the Musketeer, the case of a door being opened, whether a secret door or any other, or the case of anyone going out of or coming into the room for anything like that. My ear is as quick and sensitive as the ear of a mouse. Creaking noises make me start. It arises, I suppose, from a natural antipathy to anything of the kind. Move about as much as you like, walk up and down in any part of the room, write, efface, destroy, burn. Nothing like that will prevent me from going to sleep or even prevent me from snoring, but do not touch either the key or the handle of the door, for I should start up in a moment, and that would shake my nerves and make me ill. Monsieur d'Artagnan, said Fouquet, you are certainly the most witty and the most courteous man I have ever met with, and you will leave me only one regret, that of having made your acquaintance so late. D'Artagnan drew a deep sigh, which seemed to say, Alas, you have perhaps made it too soon. Then he settled himself in his armchair, while Fouquet, half lying on his bed and leaning on his arm, was meditating on his misadventures. In this way, both of them, leaving the candles burning, awaited the first dawn of the day, and when Fouquet happened to sigh too loudly, D'Artagnan only snored the louder. Not a single visit, not even from Aramis, disturbed their quietude. Not a sound, even, was heard throughout the whole vast palace. Outside, however, the guards of honor on duty and the patrol of musketeers paced up and down, and the sound of their feet could be heard on the gravel walks. It seemed to act as an additional soporific for the sleepers, while the murmuring of the wind through the trees and the unceasing music of the fountains whose waters tumbled in the basin still went on uninterruptedly, without being disturbed at the slightest noises and items of little movement that constitute the life and death of human nature. Chapter 20. The Morning. In vivid contrast to the sad and terrible destiny of the king imprisoned in the Bastille, and tearing in sheer despair the bolts and bars of his dungeon, the rhetoric of the chronicles of old would not fail to present, as a complete antithesis, the picture of Philippe lying asleep beneath the royal canopy. We do not pretend to say that such rhetoric is always bad, and always scatters in places where they have no right to grow the flowers which it embellishes and enlivens history, but we shall, on the present occasion, carefully avoid polishing the antithesis in question, but shall proceed to draw another picture as minutely as possible, to serve as foil and counterfoil to the one in the preceding chapter. The young prince alighted from Aramis's room in the same way the king had descended from the apartment dedicated to Morpheus. The dome gradually and slowly sank under Aramis's pressure, and Philippe stood beside the royal bed, which had ascended again after having deposited its prisoner in the secret depths of the subterranean passages. Alone in the presence of all the luxury which surrounded him, alone in the presence of his power, alone with the part he was about to be forced to act, Philippe, for the first time, felt his heart and mind and soul expand beneath the influence of 1,000 mutable emotions, which are the vital throbs of a king's heart. He could not help changing color when he looked upon the empty bed, still tumbled by his brother's body. This mute accomplice had returned, after having completed the work it had been destined to perform. It returned with the traces of the crime. It spoke to the guilty author of that crime, with the frank and unreserved language which an accomplice never fears to use in the company of his companion in guilt, for it spoke the truth. Philippe bent over the bed and perceived a pocket-handkerchief lying on it, which was still damp from the cold sweat which had poured from Louis XIV's face. This sweat-bestained handkerchief terrified Philippe, as the gore of Abel frightened Cain. "I am face to face with my destiny," said Philippe, his eyes on fire, and his face a livid white. "It is likely to be more terrifying than my captivity has been sad and gloomy. Though I am compelled to follow out at every moment the sovereign power and authority I have usurped, shall I cease to listen to the scruples of my heart? Yes, the king has lain on this bed. It is indeed his head that has left its impression on this pillow, his bitter tears that have stained this handkerchief, and yet I hesitate to throw myself on the bed or to press in my hand the handkerchief which is embroidered with my brother's arms. Away with such weakness. Let me imitate Monsieur d'Herblay, who asserts that a man's actions should always be one degree above his thoughts, and let me imitate Monsieur d'Herblay, whose thoughts are of and for himself alone, who regards himself as a man of honor, so long as he injures or betrays his enemies only. I alone should have occupied this bed if Louis XIV had not, owing to my mother's criminal abandonment, stood in my way, and this handkerchief embroidered with the arms of France would in right and justice belong to me alone if, as Monsieur d'Herblay observed, I had been left my royal cradle. Philippe, son of France, take your place on that bed. Philippe, sole king of France, resume the blazonry that is yours. Philippe, sole heir presumptive to Louis XIII, your father, show yourself without pity or mercy for the usurper who, at this moment, has not even to suffer the agony of the remorse of all that you have had to submit to. With these words, Philippe, notwithstanding an instinctive repugnance of feeling, and in spite of the shudder of terror which mastered his will, threw himself on the royal bed and forced his muscles to press the still warm place where Louis XIV had lain, while he buried his burning face in the handkerchief still moistened by his brother's tears. With his head thrown back and buried in the soft down of his pillow, Philippe perceived above him the crown of France, suspended, as we have stated, by angels with outspread golden wings. A man may be ambitious of lying in a lion's den, but can hardly hope to sleep there quietly. Philippe listened attentively to every sound. His heart panted and throbbed at the very suspicion of approaching terror and misfortune, but confident in his own strength, which was confirmed by the force of an overpoweringly resolute determination. He waited until some decisive circumstance should permit him to judge for himself. He hoped that imminent danger might be revealed to him, that those phosphoric lights of the tempest which show the sailors the altitude of the waves against which they have to struggle. But nothing approached. Silence, that mortal enemy of restless hearts and of ambitious minds, shrouded in the thickness of its gloom during the remainder of the night the future King of France, who lay there, sheltered beneath his stolen crown. Towards the morning, a shadow, rather than a body, glided into the royal chamber. Philippe expected his approach, and neither expressed nor exhibited any surprise. "Well, Monsieur d'Herblay?" "Well, sire, all is accomplished." "How?" "Exactly as we expected." "Did he resist?" "Terribly. Tears and entreaties." "And then?" "A perfect stupor." "But at last?" "Oh, at last. A complete victory and absolute silence." "Did the governor of the Bastille suspect anything?" "Nothing." The resemblance, however, was the cause of the success. But the prisoner cannot fail to explain himself. Think well of that. I have myself been able to do as much as that on former occasion. I have already provided for every chance. In a few days, sooner if necessary, we will take the captive out of his prison and will send him out of the country, to a place of exile so remote. People can return from their exile, Monsieur d'Herblay. To a place of exile so distant, I was going to say, that human strength and the duration of human life would not be enough for his return. Once more a cold look of intelligence passed between Aramis and the young king. "And Monsieur du Vallon?" asked Philippe, in order to change the conversation. "He will be presented to you today, and confidentially will congratulate you on the danger which that conspirator has made you run." "What is to be done with him?" "With Monsieur du Vallon?" "Yes. Confer a dukedom on him, I suppose." "A dukedom," replied Aramis, smiling in a significant manner. "Why do you laugh, Monsieur d'Herblay?" "I laugh at the extreme caution of your idea." "Cautious? Why so?" Your Majesty is doubtless afraid that poor Porthos may possibly become a troublesome witness, and you wish to get rid of him. What, in making him a duke? Certainly, you would assuredly kill him, for he would die from joy, and the secret would die with him. Good heavens! Yes, said Aramis phlegmatically, I should lose a very good friend. At this moment, and in the middle of this idle conversation, under the light tone of which the two conspirators concealed their joy and pride at their mutual success, Aramis heard something which made him prick up his ears. "What is that?" said Philippe. "The dawn, sire. Well, well, before you retired to bed last night, you probably decided to do something this morning at break of day." "Yes, I told my captain of the Musketeers," replied the young man hurriedly, "that I should expect him." "If you told him that, he will certainly be here, for he is a most punctual man. I hear a step in the vestibule. It must be he. Come, let us begin the attack," said the young king resolutely. "Be cautious, for heaven's sake. To begin the attack, and with D'Artagnan, would be madness. D'Artagnan knows nothing. He has seen nothing. He is 100 miles from suspecting our mystery in the slightest degree. But if he comes into this room, the first this morning, he will be sure to detect something of what has taken place, and which he would imagine it is his business to occupy himself about. Before we allow D'Artagnan to penetrate into this room, we must air the room thoroughly, or introduce so many people into it that the keenest scent in the whole kingdom may be deceived by the traces of 20 different persons." "But how can I send him away, since I have given him a rendezvous?" observed the prince, impatient to measure swords with so redoubtable an antagonist. "I will take care of that," replied the bishop. "And in order to begin, I am going to strike a blow which will completely stupefy our man." "He, too, is striking a blow, for I hear him at the door," added the prince hurriedly. And, in fact, a knock at the door was heard at that moment. Aramis was not mistaken, for it was indeed D'Artagnan who adopted that mode of announcing himself. We have seen how he passed the night in philosophizing with Monsieur Fouquet, but the musketeer was very weary of feigning to fall asleep, and as soon as earliest dawn illuminated with its gloomy gleams of light the sumptuous cornices of the superintendent's room, D'Artagnan rose from his armchair, arranged his sword, brushed his coat and hat with his sleeve, like a private soldier getting ready for inspection. "Are you going out?" said Fouquet. "Yes, monseigneur. And you?" "I shall remain." "You pledge your sword?" "Certainly." "Very good. Besides, my only reason for going out is to try and get that reply. You know what I mean. That sentence, you mean. Stay, I have something of the old Roman in me. This morning, when I got up, I remarked that my sword had got caught in one of the aiguillettes, and that my shoulder belt had slipped quite off. That is an infallible sign." "Of prosperity?" "Yes, be sure of it. For every time that confounded belt of mine stuck fast to my back, it always signified a punishment from Monsieur de Treville, or a refusal of money by Monsieur Mazarin. Every time my sword hung fast to my shoulder belt, it always predicted some disagreeable commission of another for me to execute, and I have had showers of them all my life through. Every time, too, my sword danced about in its sheath, a duel, fortunate in its result, was sure to follow. Whenever it dangled about the calves of my legs, it signified a slight wound. Every time it fell completely out of the scabbard, I was booked, and made up my mind that I should have to remain on the field of battle within 2 or 3 months under surgical bandages into the bargain." "I did not know your sword kept you so well informed," said Fouquet with a faint smile, which showed how he was struggling against his own weakness. Is your sword bewitched, or under the influence of some imperial charm?" "Why, you must know by now that my sword may almost be regarded as part of my own body. I have heard that certain men seem to have warnings given to them by feeling something the matter with their legs, or a throbbing of their temples. With me, it is my sword that warns me. Well, it told me of nothing this morning. But stay a moment. Look here, it has just fallen of its own accord into the last hole of the belt. Do you know what that is a warning of? No. Well, that tells me of an arrest that will have to be made this very day. Well, said the superintendent, more astonished than annoyed by this frankness, if there is nothing disagreeable predicted to you by your sword, I am to conclude that it is not disagreeable for you to arrest me. You? Arrest you? Of course, the warning does not concern you, since you have been arrested ever since yesterday. It is not you I shall have to arrest, be assured of that. That is the reason why I am delighted, and also the reason why I said that my day will be a happy one. And with these words, pronounced with the most affectionate graciousness of manner, the captain took leave of Fouquet in order to wait upon the king. He was on the point of leaving the room, when Fouquet said to him, "One last mark of kindness." "What is it, monseigneur?" "Monsieur d'Herblay. Let me see Monsieur d'Herblay. I am going to try to get him to come to you." D'Artagnan did not think himself so good a prophet. It was written that the day would pass away and realize all the predictions that had been made in the morning. He had accordingly knocked, as we have seen, at the king's door. The door opened. The captain thought it was the king who had just opened it himself, and this supposition was not altogether inadmissible, considering the state of agitation in which he had left Louis XIV the previous evening. But instead of his royal master, whom he was on the point of saluting with the greatest respect, he perceived the long, calm features of Aramis. So extreme was his surprise that he could hardly refrain from uttering a loud exclamation. "Aramis," he said. "Good morning, dear D'Artagnan," replied the prelate coldly. "You here?" stammered out the Musketeer. "His Majesty desires you to report that he is still sleeping, after having been greatly fatigued during the whole night." "Ah," said D'Artagnan, who could not understand how the Bishop of Vannes, who had been so indifferent a favorite the previous evening, had come in half a dozen hours, the most magnificent mushroom of fortune that had ever sprung up in a sovereign's bedroom. In fact, to transmit the orders of the king even to the mere threshold of that monarch's room, to serve as an intermediary of Louis XIV, so as to be able to give a single order in his name at a couple paces from him, he must have become more than Richelieu had ever been to Louis XIII. D'Artagnan's expressive eye, half-opened lips, his curling moustache, said as much indeed in the plainest language to the chief favorite, who remained calm and perfectly unmoved. "Moreover," continued the bishop, "you will be good enough, Monsieur le Capitaine de Musketeers, to allow only those to pass into the king's room this morning who have special permission. His Majesty does not wish to be disturbed just yet." "But," objected D'Artagnan, almost on the point of refusing to obey this order, and particularly of giving unrestrained passage to the suspicions which the king's silence had aroused. "But, Monsieur l'Evêque, his Majesty gave me a rendezvous for this morning." Later, said the king's voice from the bottom of the alcove, a voice which made a cold shudder pass through the Musketeer's veins. He bowed, amazed, confused, and stupefied by the smile which Aramis seemed to overwhelm him, as soon as these words had been pronounced. "And then," continued the bishop, "as an answer to what you were coming to ask the king, my dear D'Artagnan, here is an order of his Majesty which you will be good enough to attend forthwith, for it concerns Monsieur Fouquet." D'Artagnan took the order which was held out at him. "To be set at liberty," he murmured. "Ah!" He uttered a second "Ah!" still more full of intelligence than the former. For this order explained Aramis's presence with the king, and that Aramis, in order to have obtained Fouquet's pardon, must have made considerable progress in the royal favor, and that this favor explained, in its tenor, the hardly conceivable assurance with which Monsieur d'Herblay issued the order in the king's name. For D'Artagnan it was quite sufficient to have understood something of the matter in hand, to order to understand the rest. He bowed and withdrew a couple of paces. as though he were about to leave. "I am going with you," said the bishop. "Where to?" "To Monsieur Fouquet. I wish to be a witness of his delight." "Ah, Aramis, how you puzzled me just now," said D'Artagnan again. "But you understand now, I suppose?" "Of course I understand," he said aloud, but added in a low tone to himself, almost hissing the words between his teeth, "No, no, I do not understand yet. But it is all the same, for here is the order for it." And then he added, "I will lead the way, monsieur, monseigneur," and he conducted Aramis to Fouquet's apartment.